Hi, I'm Robin Thompson. I am a professional fundraising consultant, trainer, and coach who works with nonprofits throughout the U.S. and internationally. I have managed over $17 million in assets as executive director of a nonprofit. As vice president of development, my staff and I were responsible for raising over $10 million annually. I have experience designing and implementing a $3.9 million comprehensive campaign. Plus, I've built endowments from less than $100,000 to over $2 million in less than 2 years. In addition, I have closed not one, but 2 debt reduction campaigns. I have a fundraising certificate from Indiana University School of Philanthropy. My bachelor's degree is from West Virginia University, and my master's degree is from the University of Utah. We've got this awesome panel this morning, and I am really excited about this topic about what's your nonprofit strategy. And one of the reasons is that I get calls from people who say, "Hey, Robin, will you do some strategic planning for us?" And, you know, there's this thing in like the pit of my stomach of like, ugh, strategic planning, it's messy. I mean, there's so many different opinions and places it could go. And so that's why I'm excited to talk to these experts this morning and get their ideas on, you know, how can we have that process be messy and still get a lot out of it. So I'm going to introduce our panelists here. So first off, Chris Romer. A lot of you all know that he's the president and CEO of the Vail Valley Partnership, which is our regional chamber of commerce. His community involvement includes board service with the Western Association of Chamber Executives, Colorado Mountain College, the Tourism Industry Association of Colorado, Eagle Valley Community Foundation, the Vail Valley Foundation, and a lot of other groups. He's facilitated strategic planning sessions, I will say to you for doing that, and board retreats for chambers of commerce, towns, special districts, and nonprofits throughout Colorado and the Western US. And as you all know, the Vail Valley Partnership was voted last, I guess this year, 2020, 2021, right? As the Chamber of the Year, the National Chamber of the Year, which is pretty cool. And then we have Barb Waters, and she is a project management expert with more than 20 years experience managing processes and implementing process improvements for Fortune 500 companies. Barb worked with the first U.S. company to win the coveted Deming Prize for total quality management. She uses these guiding principles when leading organizations to achieve data-driven processes. She lives in Edwards, Colorado with her husband, Eric. She enjoys skiing, snowboarding, and if you came on earlier, you heard Barb and Katie talking about scuba diving, hiking, and community involvement. Welcome, Barb. Then we have Charles Weathers Sr. He's the founder of the Weathers Group, a management consulting firm specializing in organizational performance and leadership development for nonprofits and for-profit organizations. In his mission to positively impact lives, he's made headlines by lending his voice to disruptive companies in the nonprofit, government, and private sectors. He's a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. He volunteers for numerous organizations, including Goodwill. He's a advisor, coach, and he and his family reside in Columbia, South Carolina. And I just asked him about his book that will come out in August on strategic planning. And there's not many people out there that I know of that actually do strategic planning for nonprofits. And he works for nonprofits and for-profits. And so he'll tell you a little bit more about that book that's coming out here just a little bit later. It's not out yet, but it will be. Okay, so let's start out by just getting, you all know how this goes, that I need, when I'm interviewing people, I need to be able to put it into, okay, so let's get some background first, and then let's go through a process. So let's talk a little bit about background information first. And any of the three of you can start and just tell us a little bit about your view on the strategy of an organization.
Robin, I'll jump in, mainly because I didn't see Charles or Barb jump in immediately here. The strategy of an organization And the idea of why do you need a strategic plan? I think it's really quite simple. And a couple things there. You need a roadmap. You need a plan to identify the destination, to guide the board and the committees and the staff. Like, where are you going? Without a strategic plan, without a roadmap to know where you're going, you're probably going to end up chasing a dime that cost you $1, and that's not going to help you achieve your mission and do the good work that you're doing. When I look at the folks on this call, and so many incredible nonprofits doing such incredible work and making such an impact in our community, I really think that the best organizations have a strong strategic plan to keep them on track, and to help them prioritize identifying the important issues and programs, the ability to drop programs and stop doing things that are ineffective or no longer relevant, to allocate resources, both time and money, and really to be something that's compelling to funders, to stakeholders, to the community. So those are a couple of the reasons for just the idea of why strategy and the background behind having a strong strategic plan.
Great. Barb, you want to weigh in there?
Sure. I'd like to piggyback on the concept that Chris introduced of the roadmap and the plan as the destination. And something that we're really seeing, especially in the last few years, is that need to pivot and to drop those things that aren't going to be valuable. And so I would suggest that the roadmap is a great idea if you can be comfortable moving forward with just a framework of where you're going, and not necessarily a detailed itinerary of where you're going to be every moment, because we know that the best laid plans are just worthless if our environment pivots on us. And so taking a more of an agile approach is what I would recommend.
Great. And Charles, what about you?
Yeah, I concur with everything that's been said. And one thing I'll add to that is we love this definition of strategy. It's an integrated and coherent explanation of how an organization is going to guide its performance. And so I sum all that up into one word. It's a story. Your strategy is your story. It's an if-then story. And that story connects the dots and pulls things together, because one thing we've noticed, oftentimes in an organization, a lack of strategy creates a lack of disconnection, a lack of connection. So we're disconnected. We're not collaborating. We're not on the same page. Just imagine this. A program or service department is not aligned with the finance department, who's not aligned with the marketing department, who's not aligned with the board of governors. Strategy becomes that story that pulls everybody in together, and we kind of know where we align. And that's one of the critical functions of strategy from my perspective.
Wow. Great way to start out with looking at that background. And we'll get into a little bit more about the word Barb mentioned about pivoting, because, what I've heard so many nonprofits say that I've been working with, hey, I can't even plan for next week, let alone next month, next year, or 3 years down the road for strategy. And so, what do I do? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that we do in the nonprofit world is we do something called a case statement. And so we will have donors say to us, well, can you give me a business prospectus? And in the nonprofit world, that just does not connect, business prospectus. But in the nonprofit world, we call it a case statement. And it's basically the case for support for the nonprofit. And so when we talk about the strategic plan, a business prospectus, a business plan, like how is all that different, or is it the same? If you do a strategic plan, do you need a business prospectus and a business plan, or do you need all three of those?
I'll jump in. I'm not known to be shy, so thanks, Robin. Plus, then Charles and Barb don't say all the smart things and leave me with nothing. So, I think the how I would address that is that your strategic plan really needs to have 3 different sets of goals, and it doesn't matter what industry you're in. It doesn't matter if it's human services or or any of the other aspects that our nonprofits do, from a chamber of commerce to a private consulting firm to private sector organizations. You really need three components. One is operations. You need to focus on your leadership, your board governance, the operational things that make your organization strong, right? Like that might not be consumer facing, that might not be donor facing, but nothing else happens without strong operations. Then comes the mission work. The mission work is why you exist. That's the case stuff that you're talking about. That the mission is the business prospectus, right? It's why you exist, your mission component. But you can't achieve your mission without strong operations, right? So these things are interconnected. And the third is the engagement component. And the engagement component is, how do people touch and feel your organization? How are you telling your story? How are you engaging your donors, your volunteers, et cetera, in? So your strategic plan, and again, I really believe this is absolutely indifferent to what industry you're in. It's completely neutral. Everyone needs this. It's operations. You need strong operations. You need the mission work. The mission work is why you exist, what you do. And the engagement is how you tell people your story and get them engaged so that they move into that mission work and understand the operational component.
Great. That's a great description. Barb or Charles, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the plan should be robust enough that it can propel you forward, but not too detailed that it holds you back and becomes a matter of, well, the plan says this, but now the environment changed and we have to go back and we have to change. And so we should spend more time doing than looking back at a plan that tells us where we're supposed to be, to such a level of detail that we end up veering and having variance from the plan almost immediately. And so I noticed in the chat that Cookie said, pivot seems to be a pandemic flexibility word choice, maybe overused. And I would agree, it's definitely a buzzword for sure. And are there other terms that we could use too? And I would say lightweight and simplicity. And if we can just use those words to propel our plan, to propel us forward, and just be responsible enough that we can plan for delivering value quickly and then adapting our plan as we go.
And so Barb, talk a little bit about what those words mean, lightweight and I mean simplicity. We just, don't want it to be too complicated, but talk about the lightweight.
Well, we talked about, I think Charles and Chris both mentioned having this shared vision. And a shared vision is critical for strategy, for everybody to have a shared idea about where we're headed. And that's the framework. And we keep it light because we all have the line of sight to where we're going. But it's okay to keep our day-to-day activities fluid, meaning that just like I keep a checklist on my phone, our department, our company, our organization can keep a list of priorities that are constantly prioritized so that the things at the top of that list we know will add value and that we can deliver on them quickly. And so that's kind of what I'm saying by lightweight. Keep our plan lightweight.
I like that.
And if I can add to that, what I see happening is there are three components that I want us to consider. We call this the strategic framework in our world. And you said the words, but I'm going to tie them together: vision, mission, and values. Those three things are extremely important: vision, mission, and values. Now think about it for a second. Most people have a vision statement or mission statement or value statement. We put them on the wall, we put them on websites, we put them on the front of the board manual. We love those words, we put them everywhere. But they're more than words. They really create that strategic framework. And I believe, and from my perspective, Barb, everything you're saying is so on point and really resonating with me, because that's that framework we're operating in. And everything we do must align within that framework. And that's what really separates the strategic plan from the perspective and the business plan. And so the bottom line is, remember this, because the missing component is values. We define values as non-negotiable principles we will not compromise that guide our decision making. Those are values. So these non-negotiable principles, we will not compromise that guide our decision-making. So as Barb is saying, when we're in this space where we got to be lightweight and nimble and move, we got to have some framework for making decisions. So decisions must be informed by our values, mission, and vision, and that keeps us on the road so we don't get into that dreaded mission drift, which I know we all heard of.
Great, great description. And I see that Chris said, Cookie, we could also use the words adapt, flexible, adjust, nimble. So yeah, so I agree. I mean, there's a lot of words. You know, what was the word? What was the one word? Was it unprecedented that we kept hearing and just like, pull our hair out. We've heard it enough. So great. So I love that, Charles. Okay, so one of the things that Claire just put into the chat, and this leads right into the next question. She said we utilize a 3-year strategic plan with a 1-year work plan focused on monthly focus, which allows for flexibility. So, you know, when we talk about trends, you know, we're still, I don't know whether we can say we're recovering from the pandemic, if we're still in the pandemic, if we're in the umpteenth phase, who knows? But as you all are talking to people about their future plans, whether Barb, it's you talking about, you know, helping people with project management, or Chris and Charles, if you all are talking to people about planning, how far out are you telling them to plan? Are you telling them to still do their 3 to 5 year strategic plan? Or are you saying, hey, just keep it to a year, or just keep it to 90 days? What are you all telling people?
I'll start this one off. What we're finding are people are doing 2 to 3 year plans. I don't know about Chris and Barb, but I cannot recall the last time I saw a 5-year plan. I don't recall last time I saw a 5-year plan. It's virtually impossible to do that in today's environment from my perspective. But I'm seeing 2 to 3 year plans. But here's what I'm also seeing, Robin and everyone. The board of directors and management team are being more intentional about keeping their finger on the pulse of that plan and that strategy. So gone are the days of let's go on a retreat, do the plan, and put it on the shelf somewhere. The plan and the update on strategy are actually integral parts of the board meeting's agenda, so it's always top of mind. We're seeing that.
Right.
Yeah, I want to build on that if I can. I think that in terms of the, and pardon the Dr. Seuss-esque comment here, but the span of the plan, it really shouldn't be more than 3 years, and it really shouldn't be annual. Planning, strategic planning on an annual basis really tends, I think, to cause short-term thinking, and plans that get into 4 or 5 years are probably unrealistic in our pretty rapidly evolving environments. So 3 years, 2 to 3 years seems right to me. I like 3. And tying it back, every board meeting should be focused on how it ties back to the strategic plan. Colorado Mountain College, as one example, we do the same thing at Vail Valley Partnership, and I use CMC as an example because I'm a trustee there, and it's a big organization across a big region, bigger than the state of Maryland, different towns, etc. But every single thing on the agenda ties back to one of the strategic plan priority areas. And if it can't be tied back to a strategic priority area, it just goes in a report section, you know, for awareness sake, but we don't talk about it at the board meeting. So we're really focused on strategic areas, and everything on the agenda, to Charles' point, ties back specifically to the strategic plan. And I think it's so important not to spend your valuable time with your board doing reporting, but rather talking about strategic priority areas and how your work is tied back to those things.
And I want us all to hear that from a board member of what Chris just said, because we have a tendency to get into that mode of just reporting out to our board and reporting out with what they could just read on a piece of paper. Now, those of you that are sitting out there will say, but the board doesn't read what we send them, so then they don't know what's in there. But what we have done, I think, is we've conditioned them that we're going to read it when we get to the board meeting, so they don't need to read the material beforehand. If we condition them that we're sending you the material, you can read that, and then we can use the board meeting, like Chris said, to really look at strategy and where are we going in this next period of time between now and the next board meeting. So thank you for saying that.
And Robin, I think including a section on your in your meetings for board comment to management reports allows them the opportunity to ask questions that you might have. And if there's something you really want to reinforce to the board as a whole, you just see it a question to a board member. You ask a certain board member to say, hey, in the board comment section, bring this up because I want everyone to hear it, although it's already in the report. You can I don't want to say cheat, but you can cheat a little bit and you can reinforce those areas without dripping into the report after report after report at a board meeting.
Well, which is a great idea too, because so many times I think those of us are afraid of what the board might say. Like, that's all the money you raised? What have you been, you know, that kind of thing. So we just like, you know, just keeps coming out of our mouth so that we can keep it going instead of leaving time for them to ask questions and for that comment, because a lot of times that's when a lot of the good discussion happens, is if we've planted a seed and then the board members start talking about it and building on that, and then that just starts growing to something bigger and better. So thanks for saying that. So what about you, Barb? When you're doing project management with people, and how long out are you saying that they need to be planning?
I agree with what Charles and Chris said with the duration of a strategic plan. If we don't have a longer term plan, and by long term now I do mean more like 3 years, not 5 years, what we end up having is just a whole bunch of tasks that aren't tied to a vision. So we have to have a plan and we have to have strategy. But my recommendation is that instead of, and not just my recommendation, but best practices in our industry would say, don't make that whole 3-year time block a project. Break it into mini projects that can deliver value soon, quickly, because maybe along that 3-year stretch, you have ideas for fundraising events and various different things that will happen. But you don't have to say today what you're going to do in year 2. It's okay to know what you need to do now, and then to adapt the plan and select the next best project that will deliver value along that vision and get you where you need to be in 3 years.
And so what have you all said about going back and changing the strategic plan during this past year? Are you all saying, okay, just throw the old one out and start over? Are you saying revise it? Or, you know, how are you all telling people what they should do with that strategic plan that had those grandiose, we're going to raise $20 million over the next 3 years, and now, you know, all that's out the window? What are you telling people?
I'll start. One thing that I'm finding, and this is pretty interesting, I wonder if others are seeing this as well. When people call us and ask a question like that, and we begin to look at their current plan, we're finding out they don't have a strategic plan. They have a nice operational plan. And, and what I mean by that is they weren't operating with strategy. There was no strategy there at all. And so in many cases, they are revisiting. It's not even revising, it's starting all over. What happened in the last year, in my opinion, particularly with boards and executive teams, it caused them to ask different questions. It caused them to ask different questions, which created a different product. And I'll just say this and I'll be quiet. In our world, the document is the least important part of strategic planning. Let me say that again. The document is the least important part of strategic planning. There's something we call the 4 Ds: data, dialogue, decisions, and direction. The data, the dialogue, the decisions, and the direction. And there are many people who in the past, they were so focused on a document, those other 4 Ds were not fully fleshed out and included, and that caused problems for them. So quite frankly, we had people that had to basically scrap it or totally revise it in a manner where about 50% of it changed in order to move them forward. That's our experience.
Wow, that is very interesting, because Charles, I don't know that I would have really looked at that difference between the operational plan and the strategic plan, but that makes so much sense when I think about how some of the nonprofits are struggling about, do we do this, and let's just throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks, and oh, that looks good, let's try going that direction. And that's what it is. It's more of an operational plan.
And if I could just say this real quick, we need operational plans, going back to what Chris said earlier. We got to have operational plans. But in my perspective, operational plans and strategy, there's a different layer there, and we just got to know where one ends and the other begins. That's what I'm saying.
Wow. That's,
And
yeah.
Robin, I'd like to add to what Charles just said. You just drove something, reminded me of something that's been really key in some of our changes in project management. And we have been so focused on the what and the how, the operational part. Okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to go about doing it. But we forget the why, and the why should be the strategy, the bigger picture. What are we all here for? And why ties so much back to our values that the why tends to not change as much. The what and the how is what changes.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
I want to build on both of those comments a little bit, because I think we have a tendency to drift into the tactical. And when we're talking strategy versus tactics, I think it's really important to remember that strategies are the approaches to achieving the goals. And those can be the programs and the events and the benefits and services. And tactics really are a lower level discussion. That's the how and the who. And tactics generally are more the responsibility of committees, staff, consultants, and probably set outside of the strategic planning session and the strategic plan itself. So, Brooks' comment in the chat around the key components, I think is really good, with the suggestion that as you adjust, maybe the action plans is outside of the strategic plan, right? The action plans tie into and are connected to, but they're not part of the strategic plan. And the action plans, I think, is where, and the tactics are where things need to change really rapidly and change on a dime because of market conditions and economic conditions and SWOT analysis and other things. But vision, mission, core values, SWOT, goals, objectives, that it's not exactly evergreen because conditions change, but it certainly should last for a longer period of time. Whereas the action plans and the specific tactics, boy, that can change really quickly for a lot of different reasons.
Right. And I will say, I have a client that I don't think they're on the call today, but one of the things that they did was they provided savings account and financial literacy training for people who were undocumented immigrants, that then they could get a loan because they can't really go to a bank and get a loan. And so as soon as COVID hit, a lot of them lost their jobs. And so we started talking about, okay, so this is their mission. This is what the organization set up for. But what would happen if we gave each person $1,000, $50 of it went into a savings account, and they got financial literacy training? And we raised $1.4 million in 30 days with that. And again, we stayed within their mission, which was providing savings accounts, loans, and financial literacy training. So we stayed within the mission, but yet we just did what you were just saying, Chris, is we just changed it just slightly to help those people that really needed help at that point. So, so I totally agree with you that, as far as our mission, changing our mission during this last year was probably not a good idea. So good. Well, thank you. Okay, so now that's the background piece. Let's go into the initial research about, so, okay, we know the difference and we know what we need to do, but like, where do we start? Do we start with surveys or data, or what kind of information that we're going to gather? So Charles, let's start with you, since you literally just wrote the book on the subject, and tell us a little bit about your book, and then how you go about telling in your book, like, where do we start with all of this?
Sure, thank you. The title of the book is The Strategic Advantage, and it'll be coming out in August, and I'll be happy to, make sure everybody gets a copy, or send you the link where you can get a copy. And we're excited. We've been doing this now for 18 years as a business. And one thing I want to share with you, and I'll pull a chapter out of the book, is called stakeholder engagement. And part of the process, very early on, stakeholder engagement has to be a part of the process. And there's a tool we use called the Stakeholder River, R-I-V-E-R. River is an acronym for role, interest, values, expectations, and responsibilities. Now think about those 5 things right there. Every stakeholder for your organization, they have a different role to play in the achievement of your mission. Every stakeholder also, they have different interests. What makes one stakeholder happy makes another one upset. Stakeholders have different values, and you have organizational values, but all your stakeholders don't have the same values. Your stakeholders have different expectations of you. Think about it. Sometimes your funders have different expectations than your program participants. And also all are responsible for something different. So what do we say? You have to early on in the process, look at internal and external stakeholders. Internal stakeholders, board, staff, volunteers, as an example. External stakeholders, former board members, donors, funders, participants, clients, patients, partner agencies, vendors, funders, regulatory agencies. And the 3 ways that we have found helpful in getting information is we've done electronic surveys. We recommend that. You also can do one-on-one interviews, face-to-face or Zoom, and also focus groups. And so we give different opportunities for people to share their information. This is before any planning takes place. No planning, nothing is put on paper until we spend time asking questions, because we found that when stakeholders are engaged at the beginning of the process, they're more engaged at the end of the process when it comes to implementation. That'd be my suggestion.
Great, thank you.
And Robin, if I could, I think that I'll pick on my industry, the Chamber of Commerce business across the nation, and I think it's probably very relevant to nonprofits as well. But understand, I'm not picking on Brooke, for example. I know I can pick on Brooke when I want to, but this is not. This is more. But I think it's relevant. And what I think we do as an industry is we listen. We listen a lot, and we do a really good job of reaching out and doing surveys and having focus groups and task forces and really understanding the challenges facing our stakeholders and our communities and et cetera. But the difference between probably a highly functional Chamber of Commerce and maybe a highly functional nonprofit organization is what you do after you listen. What programs do you implement? How do you tell your story? It's the listening part is the easy part. And I think most do a really good job of the listening. The action part is where it gets really hard. You have to roll up your sleeves and you have to make tough decisions, and you have to really focus on that mission-driven work and not have the mission drift that Charles talked about a little bit before. And I think that's really a good way to think about it is, all right, we know we're listening. Now, what action are we taking? And then importantly, to the earlier comment from Chris at Colorado Health Foundation, is how do you tell your story about it, right? Like there's some folks here who do just a fantastic job of telling the story of their organization and really making it compelling and doing a good job. And almost everyone on this call does a good job of collaborating around, like Colorado Gives Day as an example, to tell the story of the impact of nonprofits altogether. But I think that's one that I think we generally do a great job of listening. We can probably do a better job of taking action, and we always need to focus on the awareness part of how we tell our story.
Can I say something real quick before Barb? Can I say this real quick, please? One thing I just want to add, if I can, and thank you, Chris, for that reminder. And I agree with you 100%. And in the listening, here's a subtle thing I want you to consider. When you're talking to stakeholders, let them know that we are speaking with you to help inform our decisions, to help shape our steps. Because what happens is sometimes there's a misrepresentation, not on purpose, but people think we're going to do exactly what they say. We're not. I mean, let's be real. We're not. But we go into the process saying, this will help us inform our decisions. Well, that's fine then. That gives us some space for creativity without having to be beholden to what everybody says. Thank you, Barb.
And I love that. I think that's great, Charles, because when we talk about stakeholders, we think about, sometimes we might accidentally use the term stakeholder management, and it's not stakeholder management, it's stakeholder engagement. And we need our stakeholders to be part of a conversation that's bi-directional. It's not just us speaking to our stakeholders or saying, thanks for filling out that survey, and then they don't hear from us again. They need to know, what did that survey tell us? What did the other stakeholders that participated in the survey say? Because if we share that and we're transparent, it, for those stakeholders who didn't get what they wanted, now they see the whole picture, and we're being more open with them about where their wants and needs fit in the whole strategy and where we're going.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the three of you mentioned was, in the nonprofit world, we do something called a feasibility study before we should do one, before we do a capital campaign, or, you know, some people call it an assessment, which is a mini feasibility study. And Charles, it's exactly what you said, that we go talk to potential donors, because then they feel like they're part of the inside. They feel like they're all a part of what we're doing. And sometimes what I see happen when nonprofits do those feasibility studies is they forget to tell them that we're not going to implement everything you say. And then they get upset. And when we go back to them, they're like, well, I mean, I told you what to do and you didn't do it. And so setting the stage when we're doing this strategic plan, I think, is so important, because we want them to continue to feel like a part of the family. And these feasibility studies, what they help us do is, as we get people on board, then they feel like they were part of the process, and then they're more likely to be a donor or to get involved in the campaign in some way. And so this whole strategic planning process is the same thing, to help us engage potential donors that are people that we want to be involved in it. So, so thank you all for that comment.
Robin, can I add one more thing about surveys? When it comes to surveys, are your surveys allowing for open-ended comment? Make sure that you're not driving what you think the results will be, because sometimes your stakeholders will surprise you and impress you with some of the ideas and thoughts that they have, and they can also inform you of risks that you might not have considered as well. So I would just encourage you to always allow some open-ended comment in any survey.
Great. I agree. And so while we're talking about surveys, Chris or Charles, I mean, like, what do you all think about surveys when we're doing a strategic plan? Good, bad, otherwise? I know that one of the things that happens is we don't seem to get a lot of responses when we do a survey. And we just did one that we said, hey, $5 Starbucks gift card if you fill this out. We got responses. So, I mean, you know, so what do you two think about the survey piece?
I think that it's important to remember that planning is not done in a vacuum, right? There's a lot of environmental influences and economic influences and community influences. The people on your board who are helping do the strategic plan and develop the strategic plan with the help of staff, they should have a good feel for the trends and the community needs, and building around the SWOT component that I think was mentioned in the chat earlier. But to directly answer your questions, I think surveys, focus groups, those types of things can and should be conducted to gain stakeholder input. You know, either the end users or the funders, the different parts of that. You should be engaging with them and listening to them. Not, I think Charles brought this up, not for the sake of saying we're going to do everything, but from the sake of making sure you have broad, big feedback into what it is you are focusing on, and your board then through the strategic planning needs to determine what are the highest impact areas to focus on. But using surveys and focus groups and task forces, I think is really, really important to make sure it's not happening in a vacuum.
Right.
I agree with that as well. And going back to something Barb said earlier, the questions, the open-ended questions, surveys aren't the problem. The problem sometimes are the questions that we have in the survey. That can be the challenge. So I'll give you an example. There's an exercise in the world of strategy called the PEST analysis, PEST. It stands for political, economic, social, and technology. Political, economic, social, and technology. We did something with a client recently that was just phenomenal. They had some stakeholders that we wanted to get information from. So we created a survey that basically had questions like this. From your perspective, what's something happening locally, statewide, or nationally in the political arena that this organization needs to have on their radar screen? What's something happening locally, statewide, or nationally, economically that this organization needs to have on their radar screen? Did the same with social and technology. You want to talk about an abundance of information. Now, the group didn't want to do it because they said, oh, those qualitative questions are going to be open-ended. I said, let me get this straight. Would you rather have good information that you have to sort through and synthesize and figure out, or just some canned 1 through 5 responses? Let's get the real information from folks. And it just gave some phenomenal data. And so those open-ended questions just opened their eyes to things that they didn't see. Remember this. Your stakeholders see things you don't see, know things you don't know, and hear things you don't hear. If we don't get an opportunity to engage them in those conversations, we'll trip over things that they saw coming that we did not.
Wow, great. Thank you. Okay, so a question in the chat box from Chris. While being informed is key for data gathering, what mechanisms do you recommend for organizational accountability to the community, donors, partners, once the work starts happening?
Boy, that seems like a loaded question. So thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. No, I mean, I think that it's the accountability aspect. Gosh, it should be front of mind with all you do, but I don't know that I have a great answer to this other than the communication back, right? It goes back to that awareness component and being able to share your successes and not being afraid to share some of your challenges. But it's really just being honest and setting the aspirational goals and sharing back out the accomplishments. But in terms of recommendations of that, I think it's just a matter of being candid and honest that sometimes you don't achieve every single thing, but you keep working towards it. And again, the idea of a strategic plan as a roadmap, sometimes there's a detour, and that's okay. But it's probably less okay to say, I refuse to take that detour and I'm going to try and go over Cottonwood Pass in my semi truck. Like that's a bad thing to do, even if Google told you it was okay, right? Like sometimes you just need to be patient. Sometimes you need to take the longer road, but be candid about it and share the successes and the challenges.
If I could add 2 things to that. Number one, just like you see nonprofits putting their 990 on their websites, we're seeing more put their strategic plan on their websites. So you can go to the website and you can see the high level priorities and the goals. Again, you don't get into the action steps and all of that come later, but at that level. The other thing as well, and I love this idea when it comes to accountability, make sure your strategic plan is integrated within your annual report. How often do we do that? We do annual reports. Is there a section in the annual report? If the strategic plan is really aligned with our work, then that strategy work should show up in the annual report somewhere, just as a suggestion.
Wow, that's a great idea, Charles. I hadn't really thought about that, because actually, when they do their case statement, there are pieces of that strategic plan that is in that case statement, but I'm thinking even more of it needs to be in that case statement. And so that's great advice. Okay, Barb, did you want to weigh in on that?
I was just going to say, also being very clear about your project approach and letting your stakeholders know that maybe we're taking an agile approach, and that means that this is the way our projects will evolve as we go, so that stakeholders understand that. Many organizations are starting to actually do a little bit of stakeholder training and making sure that the stakeholders, especially in agile, to make sure that they understand how agile works, and that they need to be more engaged more frequently if the scope of the project is going to be changing, so that the vision stays transparent, even as the vision may be slightly changing.
Wow. Good job. Yes. So here, the panel thought they were going to be stumped on that question, so I love it. Everybody was able to give a really good answer. Okay, so now in this initial planning piece, so we've talked about getting committees together, task forces or something to help us begin with the planning. So does it cost money to develop a strategic plan? And so what might that entail if it does cost money? And do we need some kind of special planning software, or what exactly, how much can we plan on it's going to cost us? How long is it going to take? What can you tell us about that whole planning process?
I'll start it off. There are a couple of options that you have. I'm going to use the South Carolina work that I do and the Southeastern work that I do. First of all, the short answer is yes, it does cost money to do strategic planning. It does cost money. Now, I've seen some organizations do some innovative things to offset that cost, get low or no cost. As an example, I've seen nonprofit organizations work with local colleges or universities, say go to the MBA students and get the MBA students to help them put their plan together, as an example. And I've seen some good plans come out of that, by the way, as well. Normally the professor will oversee the process, but that works. Also, if you have a state association of nonprofits, and I've seen chambers as well, that will step in and help offset the cost and say, we have a program where we can help you do it. We did something a couple of years ago with our state association here where we did a strategic planning boot camp. We brought in nonprofits who were not able to afford a plan themselves and spent 3 days. They were developing in real time with a facilitator leading the process. So they were writing their own plan, developing their own plan, because they couldn't pay the cost to get it done. Now, you can do it internally as well if you have a team member that's qualified to do it. Remember this, if you do it internally though, one of the values of having an external person do your strategic planning, whether it's a consultant or a student or a colleague, is that a facilitator of your plan has 3 things that you do not have. They're objective, they're neutral, and they have no decision-making authority. And sometimes that person from the outside can stand there and see things you don't see and say things you don't say. And so another example to make it low or no cost is I've seen executive directors of nonprofits swap off, and I'll say, Barb, I'll do your plan for you. You come do mine for me. So there are several innovative ways to go about doing it. Again, my team is probably saying, you're talking yourself out of business here. What are you doing? But that's not the goal here. Or you can work with consultants or other teams as well to get it done. And the process, what was the other part of that question?
So the process, how long does it take?
Oh, okay. We are, again, the way we do our planning, average is 3 months. We can get a plan done in a 3-month period of time on average. Last thing I'll say, there are levels or tiers of strategic planning. A grassroots small nonprofit organization with a budget of $75,000 a year does not need the same depth or level of planning as a nonprofit with a $2.5 million budget that covers the entire state. So consider that as well.
Great.
Yeah, and I think that generally speaking, a strategic plan does cost money if for no other reason than time is money, and you really need to put the staff time and allocate the volunteer time towards it. I think an experienced facilitator involves everyone in the discussion, helps focus on completing the plan. There's some disadvantages to having a board member or staff facilitate. And frankly, a facilitator who's been given all the information to understand the organization, you're probably going to end up with a better plan because, as Charles said, they're a little bit more removed from it. But I've facilitated for chambers, tourism groups, towns, special districts, And the idea of swapping and sharing, where, you know, someone goes and does one, and then that person comes and helps with theirs. That's such a great model, because it does bring, if you don't have a big budget to bring in a third-party facilitator, professional organization, you're still going to get that outside perspective and help do that. So it still takes time. That person volunteering can't just show up at 10 a.m. and be done by 3 p.m. You know, there's some prep work, and there's some outreach and talking to executive committee members, and, you know, doing a scan and understanding that community or that mission. But it is less expensive in terms of how long. I think doing a good strategic plan and revamping and adjusting, it does take time. It takes a couple months. You need to budget and plan for that. But you don't need to do that every year, right? You're doing that every 3 years or so. In the off years, you can do it for the cost of lunch and time, right? To just do a reset of, are these still the priorities? And let's talk about some of the programs and events and things that are leading in, and what some of our goals are that need to be adjusted. But you're not really changing the strategy at those off year sessions. So in the off years, I don't think you need to invest a lot of money, but bringing in a professional facilitator, or at least a peer to do it, is insanely valuable.
And I think those are great points. And, you know, it's interesting because I talk to nonprofits when they're doing a feasibility study, and I say to them, it is so much more effective if you get someone from the outside that's a consultant to come in, because many times the people that they're talking to will be more honest and open and transparent with somebody who doesn't work with the organization or work for the organization, or even a board member, because they have this reticence of, ooh, can I really say that to them? Or are they going to think that I'm very wealthy and I have enough money to give them a huge gift or whatever? So they have a tendency not to be as honest with somebody who's within the organization. And so I can see that being the same thing when we're talking about strategic planning. And I'll tell you, Charles, something that you just reminded me of. I was executive director of a 22-member board. And so one of the board members decided to be the facilitator of the strategic plan. So the first thing he did was he stood up and said, this organization raised about $1.5 million each year. Okay, in the next 3 years, we're going to raise $22 million. Okay, let's decide how we're going to do it. And that's how the strategic planning process started. I mean, it went down from there, and I had coached him on what we were going to say and the direction we were going to move. And it was horrible. And so having a board member, I totally agree. A lot of times that it just doesn't work very well. I love the idea of exchanging executive directors with small nonprofits. I think that's a great idea. Okay, and so Charles, that's a great idea, that the capacity building grants, they're much harder to find these days, but a lot of times a capacity building grant will help nonprofits be able to develop their strategic plans too. And I wonder if there's more of them that would want to do it now, since what we've just been through in this last year. So okay, good. Okay, so let's see, was there another question here? Okay, I think that answered Cookie's question, what if we're a small organization? So that's good. Okay, so now let's talk about who should be involved. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, the community. So when you're doing your strategic plan, so should your board be a part of those stakeholder committees? Should you be bringing your donors in? Should you even bring in program participants? Should you just put it out there to the general public? Like, again, this is that whole process I talked about, how strategic planning is just so messy. So who are the key people that we need to be sure are involved in this planning process?
Robin, I'll just provide one tactical approach, and it's when we're identifying stakeholders at the very, very start of a project. Anybody who can impact the project or be impacted by the project. And I keep saying the project, but the plan. Anybody could be considered a stakeholder, but we don't have the bandwidth to necessarily have one-on-one interviews and conversations with every stakeholder. So a stakeholder analysis could be as simple as a matrix where you just say, okay, of my big list of stakeholders that I know about today, because it's always evolving, which ones have the highest level of interest in this and maybe the highest level of influence? You can use other factors, other variables. It could be power and interest, but interest and influence are pretty good. And then in that grid, high power, high interest, high influence is going to be those stakeholders you manage the most closely. And really you want them to have a seat at the table. Now, beyond that, I defer to Charles and Chris about specifically who attends which meetings. I think they'll know more than they'll be able to contribute more to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know Charles is going to have good feedback on this one, but I believe a board member should be part of every committee. I think you want the people involved in that level of discussion to be able to come back to the entire group and share the perspective of those other working groups. So have a board member on every committee. I think it's essential. I would also say, if feasible and if possible, have a staff on every committee. Again, they're the ones doing the work, and they'll be able to share the boots on the ground bandwidth and things much more than a board member who might be aspirational and throwing out these, we're going to raise $22 million when historically we raise 1.5. Staff in the room might say, hey, time out, let's bring it back down to reality. I do think we have a tendency of tapping the usual suspects. And that would be the donors, the volunteers, the people who are already invested in the organization. So I would encourage everybody to broaden the horizon a little bit with inviting other stakeholders in the community, and maybe view it as a pipeline of future donors or future volunteers. Who are other people in the community that you've wanted to be involved in your organization? You haven't been able to get them in as a volunteer or donor or board member or whatever the case. Get them into these types of planning meetings, because then they'll be a little bit emotionally invested in the outcome. They're going to probably want to see it through. So I would say an all of the above approach is probably the way that I would recommend.
And I have to admit, in full disclosure, I'm a relational person, so I want to talk to everybody. So let me just put that out there. I'm talking to everybody. It's interesting, when I go into a town or community, this was pre-COVID, to do strategic planning, I'll normally arrive like a week in advance of the session. Now, we've done work to that point, but a week in advance, I arrive in town, and I'm going to coffee and dinner and lunch, and I'm just talking to the community about the organization. I'm just trying to find out what's going on. It's not a formal survey, but just dialogue. So number one, I'm going to talk to as many people as possible and find a way to get input. Why? Let me tell you why. There are people out there who are impacted by your mission, but they don't know what's your mission impacting them. It's very important, folks. Let me say that again. There are people who are impacted by your mission, but they don't know your mission is impacting them. They don't even know. They actually have a stake in your success, and they don't know. So if we only go to the people who we know, I'm telling you, we're missing out on something. So we've got to really get uncomfortable in this process and start talking to the people we think we don't need to talk with, because that's part of this process and part of this dialogue. So this is why it takes time. This is why you're not going to do it on one weekend or one. Take time, have the energy to get out there and engage in relationship development. That is part of this overall process. So Robin, I think you try to find a way to reach out to everybody in the community, even the folks who you think have nothing to do with what you do or to gain from it. I promise you there's lessons to be learned there.
Wow, and that's very interesting, because Charles, what that just made me think of was there was a survey that I just saw as to why donors stop giving to nonprofits. And the number one reason, as we can imagine, is they don't have the money to be able to give. But the number two reason was because they didn't know that the nonprofit needed their money. And so that's exactly what you were just saying about how important it is. They don't know the impact that they're making unless we tell them, because a lot of times donors feel like, well, I can't give them $1 million. So yeah, my, $100 or 1,000 or 10,000 is probably really not going to make a difference. But yet what we're hearing from granting foundations is that where they used to give a pretty good size grant to large nonprofits, and they really weren't seeing the impact. But then when they spread out into the rural areas and found that they gave that same amount of money, and it made a huge difference and a huge impact. And so what's important is that we're able to share that with our donors. So I think that's key. So thank you for bringing that up.
Robin, can I throw something back in on what you just said real quick? The word awareness comes to mind for me, folks. And let me ask you to consider this. There's an assumption we make around awareness. We assume that greater awareness will result in greater action, and it does not all the time. And here's why. There are 4 levels of awareness I want you to consider in your community with your organization. Level 1, there's no awareness. They don't even know we exist. Level 2, awareness. They know who we are. They know the name, right? Next level, they know who we are and they know what we do. That's level 3. Here's the key, level 4. They know who we are, they know what we do, and they know why. There's Barb's word. They know why we do it and they see value in it. If we can get to that 4th level of awareness, that's where action happens on behalf of stakeholders. So we've got to help create that. And that's why, going back to Chris's point, when you pull people together to help pull your plan together, we call it an SWG, strategy work group. And the strategy work group can have board members, staff members, executive team members, volunteers, donors, and others. You get a diverse group of people in the room who can sit there and help work with the consultant or the facilitator, whomever, to help move this process forward to make sure all the voices are heard. And that helps you get that deep awareness, and then the action comes.
Great. And so now we have all this information. Charles has talked to everybody and his brother. And so we have all this information. How do we assimilate it? How do we put it together? And, Barb, I'm sure that, with your whole project management side about, so is there software we need, or is there, what do we do with it? Because I think that's one of the reasons that I find strategic planning so hard, is because, we have 5 million flip charts that we've used on the wall. And so we have all this information, and then I'm supposed to take it and whittle it down and figure out how, what's important, and how do I take that and how do I put it in the plan? So, how do we do that? How do we assimilate it and write the plan?
Well, I think of it as the way of the whiteboard looks at the end of a brainstorming session. And having attended many of Chris's brainstorming sessions, and we know that there are next steps. You have to take all of those great ideas and all of that great feedback and do something meaningful with it. And so there are a few different tools you can use, and some of them have to do with just finding similar ideas and putting them together, blocking them into categories. And then you really do have to have one person who owns the vision. And by that, we want the vision to be shared, but one person needs to be responsible for prioritizing this list and determining what actions need to be taken first. And so I think Chris has done plenty of that from our brainstorming sessions. I've seen the mess we leave you at the end of a meeting, Chris, and I know that you make sense of it afterward and report on it.
Yeah, I don't know. That's debatable, I suppose, but thanks for the kind words. I'm going to build on that a little bit. I think that anytime you do a strategic planning session and having this new strategic guide to move your organization forward, there's a natural kind of human nature temptation to return to your daily tasks. So focusing on the implementation and integration of the plan is so important. And Barb brought this up, but it's worth repeating. I like to call it a plan champion. How are you monitoring and reporting on that success? how are you aligning your committees, your task forces, your groups back to those goal areas? I mentioned in our case, Colorado Mountain College, Vail Valley Partnership, everything on the agenda ties back to one of the strategic priority areas. That keeps the strategic areas front of mind for staff and for the board. If you can, you have the performance measures and then really sharing the review of your progress and sharing the information out to your stakeholders. I think the website, having your plan on your website, I think is a great idea. That Charles brought that up before. How are you transparent with how you're sharing that? But the short answer is you need to avoid that human nature of, all right, we just went through this process, and now we're just going to return to the daily tasks and kind of make this report something that sits on a shelf. You need to do everything you can to avoid that. And having a plan champion and putting everything on your agendas, tying back to it, it prevents that from happening.
And the one thing I'd like to add to that is we are finding more and more organizations, here's the language they use. They'll say, we have a strategic plan, then they'll say we have an operational plan, and then there's a work plan. So strategic plan, operational plan, work plan. And so if I'm staff on the front line, that's my work plan. My department has an operational plan. The organization has a strategic plan, and they all feed up into each other. So after the strategic plan is done, the next phase is then operationalizing it and then moving it into that work plan with the staff as well. And by the way, the value in that is that the staff see themselves in the plan. Never let anyone say this, that's the board's plan. No, no, this is our plan. So while we might say the board is responsible to make sure the strategic plan gets done, the staff is part of the process, management is part of the process to build that plan out. And also we're seeing more and more organizations create dashboards with those KPIs, key performance indicators. What are our fundraising KPIs? What are our financial management KPIs? What are our program and service delivery KPIs? What are the KPIs that are associated with our strategy? Don't assume that happens, because I've seen KPIs that have nothing to do with strategy. So we're measuring something and it looks good we're measuring, but we're still not achieving the vision and mission. Make sure it's aligned.
And so as you all are talking about that, so let's say, I'm doing a strategic session with a nonprofit, and there is a donor who wants to give money for a swimming pool. That does not fit with their mission. It doesn't align with any of those, but this donor wants to give a lot of money for it. And if they build the swimming pool, then they're going to have to get insurance. It's going to open up a whole new host of things. Okay, so you're in these strategic planning sessions, you're in these task force meetings, and somebody keeps coming up with something like that doesn't fit, that they're adamant. We've got somebody who wants to give us a bunch of money. So what do we do when we see that happening? Like Chris, you've got all these whiteboards, you've got all these, different areas. What do you do with the swimming pool?
Do you want Chris to?
Yeah, so one thing that I often do is, and you guys have all seen this at different sessions you've been a part of, but you have a parking lot. So you put ideas that might not be aligned with your organization into a parking lot. And that's a nice way of saying, sometimes we're going to revisit this and see where it fits. And sometimes saying, this idea is so far out of what the scope and mission of this organization is, that we're going to take it under advisement. Thank you very much. Right. And sometimes that might be, it doesn't mean you forget about it, and it doesn't mean you completely discount it, but it might be then taking it back and saying, okay, that fits better with so-and-so's organization. And I have enough strength and confidence in my mission that we can continue to engage this donor. And I'm not afraid to say, if this person really cares about doing a swimming pool, I'm going to connect them to mountain recreation. I'm going to connect them to someone else whose mission it is aligned with. I think that level, it takes courage, right? Because if someone wants to give you X amount of dollars for something that's not in your mission, to say, I'm going to connect them to another nonprofit in the community, and I know they're going to give that other nonprofit X number of dollars that I could have had. But it's better, and it will win you goodwill. Collaboration is sometimes hard, but don't be afraid to say no. The idea of doing everything, it's going to cause the mission drift, and it's going to cause you way more problems, and you're going to lose donors in the long run. So parking lot it, sometimes forget about it, oftentimes connect them to someone else who can help them achieve that goal.
Great answer.
The number one cause of mission drift in the nonprofit sector is chasing money. We start doing things we have no business doing because somebody will give us money. That is the number one cause of mission drift. As Chris just said, no, N-O, no is a strategic word. Not now, is it that no is I can tell your strategy by what you say no to. So early on in the process, we got to let the board, staff, and others, we are going to say, and that's where the values come in. We're going to make some values.
Charles, you're cutting out. I don't know. Yep. Huh. Yeah, we can't hear you. So something happened and you just cut out. Look down on the left side under your mute and see if somehow you got muted.
What about that? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I was just saying that no is a strategic word. And that's why we have to make those values-based decisions to protect us. And sometimes we have to protect ourselves from ourselves. And so let people know going into the process that no will be part of this engagement, or maybe not now, but be aware of that. That's all.
Great.
Robin, it looks like Cookie chatted in that they have a gift acceptance policy that helps. That's a great idea. So the words are already there. It's not uncomfortable. It just, when you said that, it made me think about somebody giving you a puppy and thinking that they, did you a nice favor.
That's great. Yeah. And so that gift acceptance committee. So I suggest that nonprofits not only have a gift acceptance committee, or policy, but they also have a committee. And I was at an organization where they had accepted some solar panels. It was an educational institution that did renewable energy, and they accepted these solar panels, which were great. But the solar panels were faulty and didn't work. So then we as the nonprofit had to pay to dispose of those because they had hazardous materials in there. I have turned down gifts of live ammunition. I've turned down timeshares, and so by having that gift acceptance committee, it can just be a couple of board members. What happens is that then it takes that off of me so that I don't have to be the one to say no to the swimming pool, no to the solar panels. We have a gift acceptance committee, a gift review committee is what we call it. And so Cookie, that's great that you say that. Okay, good. All right, so we have some questions in the chat box. So let's go over here and because I want to be sure and answer some of these questions. So Christine said, if you are a staff of one, can that plan champion be a board member? And I think we kind of answered that it's better not to. Do you all have any other feedback on that?
Yeah, I had shared in the chat back to that. I think it's fine actually to have a board member or a volunteer be the plan champion. It's a plan that has already been adopted by the board, and you're going to someone who cares enough about it that wants to kind of own that, but the staff still needs to be involved, right? You're not abdicating all of the responsibility. You still need to keep them on track, and you still need to make sure they're not drifting off of that. But I personally speaking, if someone cares enough to be the champion for that, I'm happy to let them do that. It often adds gravitas to the discussion.
Great. Okay, thank you. Charles or Barb, do you have anything else you want to say about that?
Really nothing to add. I concur with Chris. I'm good with that.
Okay, so if you all have any questions, if you want to put them in the chat box, or you want to raise your hand and then we'll unmute you. But in the meantime, I'll keep going, and then I just have a few more questions. And so if you all have burning questions too. So let's talk a little bit about mistakes to avoid. What is it that can torpedo the strategic planning? Make sure it's not that strategic plan that sits up on the shelf that we never get off the shelf. Talk a little bit about mistakes that we want to avoid.
I'll give you two. And I think they're probably, in my view, the most important two. Number one is the wrong people at the planning table, right? People who don't get the mission. We want to be broad and we want to invite new people in, but we don't want to have the wrong people at the planning table, right? We need to have those visionary leaders. We need people who understand the purpose of a strategic planning meeting. And the second is the failure to include any kind of performance measure or timeline in the actual business plan component, right? You need to have those, call it SMART goals or whatever acronym you prefer, but it can't just be large, high aspirational aspects. You need to include and make sure that you're following it up with the action. Back to what I said before, with doing a really good job of listening and maybe a less good job of actually doing. We need to make sure that we're building in the doing.
Well, I'll add one more to that, and I agree with those. I think one of the biggest mistakes I see people make, excuse me, is simply this: not recognizing the impact that organizational culture has on strategy. That's a mistake. I think it was Peter Drucker, the old school management consultant, that said, "Culture will eat strategy for breakfast." I think that was him. And we get strategies and plans and processes and structure and staffing, but we don't think about the culture implications of what we're doing. So I would say just be aware of that. Your strategy is influenced by your culture and vice versa. Just be aware of that dynamic and that healthy tension between the two, and make sure that you're considering that as you move forward. So begin asking questions like this: what are some of the unintended consequences of this priority? We don't consider that. We spend so much time focusing on what we want that we don't think about what might happen that we don't want. Quick example. My son, he got a AAA card, and I tell all my kids, you got to have a AAA card. You have to. Why do you need a AAA card? Well, one day he's out late at night, he gets a flat tire, calls AAA, gets fixed. I said, that's why you need the card. I said, now you don't think about getting stuck late at night where you can't get to the tire and so on, but think about the unintended consequences of what we do. And a lot of times in planning, we don't do that. We just think about what we want, so we don't prepare for what we don't want.
Wow. Awesome.
And I would say and this just reiterates something we talked about earlier, which is to keep the strategic plan lightweight and not to accidentally pull in the work plan into the strategic plan, because rework gets expensive, it's time consuming, and it doesn't deliver value. And to really try to let the work teams own their work and just understand the line of sight to the strategic vision, but let them organize around their work because they see it more closely than anybody and they know how to get things done.
Perfect.
So not to fall into that trap of top-down management.
I think that's so important, Barb, and worth reiterating, be it a board or within a staff team. The concept is the strategic plan is where you want to go. And if people want to take different ways to get there, you need to recognize that that's okay. And that's not only is it okay, you should embrace that. And it doesn't all need to be done one way. So a board member saying, I would have done it this way. Well, that doesn't really matter, does it? As long as we get there, and it's okay to provide feedback and coaching and things, but to say, you need to do it this way, that's not a really effective way of running an organization.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna just ask, does anybody have any burning questions that they don't want to type into the chat box? And if you do, just raise your hand, your real hand, if you're on video, and if not, then just let me know if you have a question that you want to ask, and I'll just keep rolling if you all don't have any questions. So let me see here. I need to look at my screen to see if anybody has any questions. Okay, I can't believe how fast this time's gone by. It's like I look at the clock and I'm like, we've got 10 minutes left. Oh no, you guys are so good. I just want to ask a ton more questions, but we will end it with this last question. If I could wave my magic wand and bestow one piece of knowledge, or if you could wave your magic wand and bestow one piece of knowledge or wisdom on the nonprofits, what would it be when they are looking at their strategy and, you know, coming out of this whole pandemic and all of this, what would that one major thing that you would want if you had a magic wand?
I have one, Robin, and this I had to remind myself about in the past year or so, and that is stop looking back at the way the plan didn't evolve and look for the opportunities that are now in front of you. Because when the environment changes, sure, some of the things you thought you were going to do, you can't do anymore, but there might be new opportunities. So rather than looking at it as a loss, look at it as, what can I do with the new information that I have?
Yeah, I think that, well, number one, it would be giving everyone millions and millions of dollars. Like if my magic wand exists and I can just give everyone, increase their budget by millions, I'm going to do that. Outside of that, my magic wand isn't that effective. So what I would say is remember to tell your story. I think there's so many, and I see it and I know it. There's so many organizations and people doing such good work. And sometimes they're so focused on the work that they forget to tell the story. So making sure you keep front of mind. So having that would be my magic wand, my realistic magic wand versus the millions of dollars for everybody that I would really wish them, is how do you focus on telling your story to be able to reach the greatest number of people, to increase your reach and your consideration and your conversion into donors or volunteers or whatever your need is.
Right.
And the one thing I would add to that is that I would let the nonprofits know we are better together. And what I mean by that is the spirit of collaboration is going to be critical going forward, even in the world of strategy. So if we're sitting in a room with other nonprofits on a coalition or a consortium or something of that nature, all of our vision, mission, and values may not be the same, but there's some alignment there. And let's talk about that and how the achievement of my strategy helps your strategy and so on. That interconnectedness, that synergy between organizations will help all of our strategies get achieved. And ultimately, the bottom line is the community benefits. And isn't that what we want? So we're better together.
Great. Oh, I love your magic wands. Can I just give you a magic wand so that we can have all of that? Okay, so as we're wrapping up, let me just say that we bring the Nonprofit Learning Series to you as a free benefit because we have the sponsors of the Vail Valley Partnership. Thank you, Chris. We have US Bank as a sponsor, and we also have Mountain Youth. I do it for free, and there's no money exchange from them. They just provide the mailing list, the platform, all of that. And I know that I am doing a series for the Northwest Small Business Development Center on how to start a nonprofit. And some people thought, oh no, you're not going to do the Nonprofit Learning Series anymore for free. And so we are still doing it for free. Our next one is on July 22nd from 11 to 2:30. And so hopefully you all put that on your calendar. We are still firming up our panel for that month. But I want to thank our panel so much today. I mean, like I said, this time just flew past because you all had such great ideas. And so I will leave it to the three of you. If you have anything else that you'd like to say, anything I didn't ask that you think I should, or anything you saw in the chat box that you'd like to weigh in on. I mean, I saw that Chris put in there about a book, and now it just went, woo, because all of you are putting things in there, by Greg McCowan on the book Essentialism, the Disciplined Pursuit of Less. Ooh, that sounds good. Okay, Kim does have a question here. How often or when is it appropriate for an NPO to consider adjusting its mission statement? Perhaps changes in technology create that need as one example. So how often is it appropriate to change the...
I think with your strategic planning every 3 years, you want to look at your mission statement. It's probably not something that that is thrown out and completely different, right? It's going to be iterations, but it should be something you look at as you update your strategic plan on how do you keep it relevant? How do you keep it fresh? How do you keep it the highest level of impact? And how do you keep it short that every board member can remember it? So adjusting it every 3 years, I think, is completely appropriate. Wholesale changes to your mission statement is a much bigger discussion that probably needs adult beverages.
Yeah. Well, when we're doing planning, again, every 3 years, as Chris said, we revisit, we call it revisiting, we revisit the mission. Is this still relevant? Is it viable? Is it impactful? We ask that question, we explore that. And by the way, this is also why we suggest you do not put your programs or services in the mission statement, because your programs and services may change and the mission stays the same. So don't confuse approach with mission.
Well, if there are no more questions, you all speak now or forever hold your peace. Cookie said we look at ours annually as the first step in the operating, fundraising, et cetera, plan for the year. That's great. Okay, any other questions? Anything? Well, let's give our panelists a hand and high five on all sides of your cube here. Do the high five for each other, that we are all going to be able to see each other in person, and to thank our presenters this morning, because it has just been phenomenal. Thank you all. And we'll see you July 22nd, hopefully in person before that.